In today's world, when we talk about God, we know exactly who we're referring to. For most people, God is a word that's enough, a concept that immediately connects us to the idea of a supreme being, the creator of everything, who is above all things. We don't need any more details. But what if we traveled back in time to a world where this idea wasn't so simple? Let's go back thousands of years to the heart of the Middle East. Reality was quite different then. Back in those days, people lived in a polytheistic world, a world where there wasn't just one God, but many. Imagine being surrounded by gods, each with their own name, their own function, their own power. You couldn't just say, "I believe in God," because everyone would ask, "Which one?" In this context, naming the gods was essential. Each people had their own gods, and they named them carefully. There was Baal, the god of the Canaanites, Dagon, the god of the Philistines, and Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. And, of course, there was the God of Israel. But here's the interesting part. The God of the Israelites also needed a name. He wasn't just God. He was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this God had a name that distinguished him from the other gods. In this polytheistic world, saying, "I serve God" wasn't enough. You had to be specific. Imagine a conversation between two leaders from different nations. "I serve Baal, the god of thunder and storms," one would say, "and I serve Chemosh, who protects us and gave us this land," the other would reply. Then an Israelite, like Moses, for example, would have to say, "And I serve YHWH, the God of my fathers, the creator of the heavens and the earth." But why was this so important? Because in that world, gods weren't just distant spiritual beings. They were seen as the invisible rulers of specific lands. If one nation conquered another, it meant the god of the victorious nation was stronger than the god of the defeated one. So, the name of a god wasn't just a name. It was a banner of power, a declaration of authority. And it's at this point that we begin to see the difference with the God of Israel. While other peoples had gods associated with specific roles like harvest, rain, or war, the God of Israel was presented as the God of everything. And more than that, he was a God with a special purpose. He revealed himself, spoke to people, made covenants with them. He wasn't just one God among many. He was the true God, above all others. In this world full of gods, it was necessary to name the God you served. This told everyone which power you followed, which spiritual kingdom guided your steps. And for the people of Israel, that name carried a promise, an identity, something much deeper than just a word. Now, imagine a fierce dispute between two ancient peoples, the Israelites and the Ammonites. Both claimed the same land, a land that, to each side, was sacred because they believed it had been given to them by their God. Amid this tension, a man named Jephthah rises up, an Israelite leader who needed to defend his people's right to that land. But Jephthah knew that simply saying, "This land is ours," wouldn't be enough. In a world where gods decided the fate of nations, he needed divine justification. He stands before the Ammonites and says something very interesting. Instead of just declaring, "This land belongs to Israel because God gave it to us," he does something smarter. He acknowledges that the Ammonite people also believed their land came from a god. He turns to his enemies and says, "The land you have was given to you by Chemosh, your god, but the land we Israelites have was given to us by our God." Here's the brilliance of Jephthah. He doesn't deny the power or the belief of the Ammonites in their own God. He respects this polytheistic view, but also reaffirms the superiority of the God of Israel to his people. It wasn't just a matter of military strength or who arrived first. To him, the right to the land was a matter of divine order. This dispute between the Israelites and the Ammonites was more than a territorial fight. It was a battle of beliefs, where each side believed their God was the one who legitimized their presence there. The fascinating part is that, even in this environment full of gods, Jephthah maintained the conviction that his God, the God of Israel, had the final right over that land. He presents the name of God as the ultimate authority that justifies their claim, above all others. At this moment, it becomes clear that, in the ancient world, lands didn't belong only to those who cultivated them or won battles. The lands belonged to the gods. and the people who served the victorious God were the ones who had the right to occupy them. When Jephthah defends his land, he's not just defending borders. He's proclaiming the sovereignty of the God of Israel over that piece of earth. And it was at this very point that the name of the God of Israel became more than just a title. It represented a covenant, a living promise that placed the Israelites in a unique position among the other nations. Then, amid these territorial and spiritual disputes, something fascinating happens. Centuries later, archaeologists discover an artifact that transports us directly back to this era of gods and battles over land. The famous Mesha Stele, also known as the Moabite stone. Imagine for a moment this stone slab, inscribed with words that tell a story of victory and defeat between nations. But the most intriguing part is that this stone, created by the Moabites, enemies of Israel, mentions the name of the God of Israel. Yes, the name of the Israelites' God is there, carved in stone, but not in the way you might expect. The Mesha Stele celebrates the liberation of Moab from Israelite rule. According to what's inscribed, King Mesha, the Moabite leader, managed to reclaim his land because his god, Chemosh, had regained favor with the people. To them, this victory was much more than a military achievement. It was clear evidence that Chemosh had triumphed over the God of Israel, whose name is directly mentioned on the stone. But here's the crucial detail. The stele doesn't just celebrate this victory, it also recounts that, in defeating the Israelites, the Moabites captured sacred objects from the Israelite temple and placed them at the feet of Chemosh. This wasn't just a military humiliation. By doing this, they were affirming the superiority of their God over the God of Israel. And it's in this very context that we find the name of the Israelite God carved for the first time clearly in an archaeological record. Those 4 enigmatic letters, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, carved in a variant of the Phoenician script, they represent the oldest written mention of the God of Israel that we have today. The curious thing is that this first appearance of the name of the God of Israel didn't come from the hands of the Israelites themselves, but from their rivals, the Moabites. This tells us a lot about how deeply and seriously these gods were viewed in the ancient world. Even Israel's enemies recognized the power of YHWH to the point of mentioning him in their victory celebrations. This stone, this record, is a silent testimony of a time when nations firmly believed that the strength of their gods manifested in battles and conflicts. For the people of Moab, their victory over Israel wasn't just a political matter. It was proof that, at least in that moment, their God had prevailed. However, as history would show, the name YHWH would persist. That name engraved on the Mesha Stele would gain new strength, survive the passage of time, and continue to be invoked by generation after generation, even though, at that moment, the Moabites thought they had defeated the God of Israel. This artifact shows us that, even in the midst of the most intense disputes, the name of the God of Israel was there, present, echoing in the words and deeds of other nations, even when they believed he had been overcome. But here's something that makes this story even more fascinating. The name YHWH, the one the Moabites carved into their triumphant stone, wasn't just any name. Its writing is an enigma that has endured through the centuries. Those 4 mysterious letters, Yod, He, Vav, He, carry with them a challenge. How do we pronounce this name? You see, in ancient times, vowels weren't written. Imagine trying to read a text without any vowels. People of that era knew how to pronounce words because they heard them regularly in spoken language. But the name of God, YHWH, began to be treated in a special way, and as time passed, its pronunciation was lost. Here comes the first difficulty. How exactly do we pronounce a name written only with consonants? For centuries, the exact pronunciation of God's name was passed down orally, from generation to generation. But something began to change. And this change wasn't just for linguistic reasons, but for something even deeper, a sense of reverence and awe for the divine name. The second difficulty arises when, at a certain point in history, the Israelites themselves began to avoid pronouncing this name. The reason? Perhaps it was a strict interpretation of the commandment. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Or maybe it was the fear that, by pronouncing this sacred name incorrectly, they would disrespect the holiness of God. Whatever the reason, the fact is that, at some point, people stopped saying God's name out loud. This decision transformed the name YHWH into something even more mysterious and sacred. Imagine living in a time when the name of God could only be spoken by the high priest, and only on a specific day of the year, Yom Kippur, inside the most sacred space of all, the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. This level of restriction meant that, over time, people simply didn't know how to pronounce God's name anymore. Moreover, some traditions, like that of the Samaritans, kept this name even more secret. It was said that only the priests knew the pronunciation, and this knowledge was passed down from one priest to another in secret, generation after generation. The name of God, which was once spoken freely, became an almost indecipherable mystery. But here's the great paradox. Even though the name was written countless times, its pronunciation was lost. And this is something that even ancient texts began to reflect. In the 3rd century BCE, when the Jews translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the famous Septuagint, they didn't dare write the tetragram as it was. Instead, they replaced the name YHWH with words like Kyrios, Lord, or Theos, God. Even in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, the name YHWH doesn't appear. Instead, terms like Lord or God are used, continuing the tradition of avoiding the direct pronunciation of the divine name. What began as an act of reverence evolved into a linguistic and spiritual mystery. The name of God, which was once spoken, became so sacred that future generations no longer knew exactly how to speak of him. And so, that Moabite stone, with the name YHWH carved into it, doesn't just tell the story of an ancient victory, but also the story of how a sacred name can become an enigma over time. This tetragram, these 4 letters, continue to echo through history, not just as a name, but as a symbol of the mystery and majesty of the God of Israel. Over time, this reverence for the name of YHWH grew so much that not only was the pronunciation lost, but the name also began to be replaced in sacred texts. Instead of the tetragrammaton, scribes and translators started using substitutions, and this leads us to the next part of this fascinating story. Imagine the first translators of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, around the 3rd century BCE, facing the enormous responsibility of preserving the sacred texts. They knew that the name YHWH was too sacred to be written or spoken lightly. So what did they do? They replaced the divine name with words like Kyrios, Lord, or Theos, God, in their translations. This practice quickly became standard, and these substitutions began to appear in almost all subsequent translations, both in the Old and New Testaments. What's interesting here is that this practice of substituting God's name wasn't just a matter of respect or reverence. It was also a way of protecting the mystery surrounding it. By using Lord or God instead of YHWH, people avoided even the risk of profaning the divine name. This caution spread throughout Jewish communities, and even after Hebrew fell out of use in many places, this substitution continued. And it wasn't only in the Greek translation that this happened. In Jewish tradition itself, the public reading of the Torah followed the same pattern. When Jews read the scriptures and came across the tetragrammaton, they didn't pronounce the name YHWH. Instead, they said Adonai, which means Lord. This practice continues in many communities to this day. But the substitution of the divine name didn't stop there. When the texts were translated into Latin, the tetragrammaton was no longer present. The word Dominus, Lord, replaced the name YHWH, and this tradition remained. Even in the Bibles we read today, this practice continues. If you open a modern Bible, in most cases where YHWH's name should be, you'll find the word Lord in capital letters, a kind of code that keeps this ancient tradition of substitution alive. What's fascinating is that this editorial decision to substitute God's name wasn't hidden. In many Bibles, you'll find explanations about this in the introductions or footnotes, informing readers that, out of respect and tradition, YHWH's name was replaced with Lord. However, few people pay attention to this, and the practice continues as one of the great linguistic and theological legacies of antiquity. Thus, the name of God, which was spoken for centuries, became an almost invisible word, replaced by more common terms. But behind every Lord or God we read is the sacred mystery of YHWH, the name that once echoed in ancient stones but out of reverence, is no longer pronounced. This tradition, which began in ancient Jerusalem and spread across the world, shows us how faith and respect can shape even the way we handle words. The name YHWH, once so central, was hidden in plain sight, preserved in a way that keeps its sanctity intact. And now we continue to carry this heritage. Every time we encounter Lord in our Bibles, we are, in a way, connected to that long line of reverence and mystery that began centuries ago, when the first scribes decided that God's name was too powerful to be pronounced so easily. But even with all this reverence and care, the story of YHWH's name doesn't end there. Over the centuries, attempts to understand and restore the pronunciation of God's name have continued. And although the name was replaced by Lord or God in the sacred texts, scholars and religious leaders still tried to unravel the mystery of how YHWH was originally pronounced. This brings us to the fascinating issue of vocalization. During the Middle Ages, a group of Jewish scribes called the Masoretes dedicated themselves to preserving the correct pronunciation of Biblical Hebrew. They created a system of diacritical marks, small signs placed around the letters to indicate vowels, since ancient Hebrew didn't record vowels in writing. And it was in this context that the Tetragrammaton reappeared, this time surrounded by vowel marks. But here's the interesting part. When the Masoretes added these vowels around the Tetragrammaton, they weren't actually trying to record the exact pronunciation of God's name. What they did was insert the vowels of another word, Adonai, to remind readers that when they encountered YHWH in the text, they should say Adonai instead of trying to pronounce God's real name. Thus, the Tetragrammaton YHWH appeared in the scriptures with the vowels of Adonai, resulting in the famous form Jehovah, a combination of YHWH's consonants with Adonai's vowels. This is the origin of the name Jehovah, a hybrid form that was widely used but doesn't reflect the original pronunciation of God's name. But even with this Masoretic practice, the true pronunciation of the name remained a mystery. We know that the name likely began with the sound Yah, as it appears in ancient Hebrew names like Yeshua, Jesus, or Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Additionally, scholars believe that the closest form to the original pronunciation is Yahweh or Yav, an attempt to reconstruct the sound based on linguistic studies and historical records. However, even with this reconstruction, the exact pronunciation has never been confirmed. And this isn't just due to the loss of oral tradition or the lack of vowels in the writing. The name YHWH was something deeper, more sacred, that transcended mere vocalization. It was a name that didn't need to be spoken to be powerful. Beyond Hebrew, there's another interesting point to consider. Ancient Greek authors, who wrote about the Jews and their beliefs, tried to record the name YHWH in their own texts. But the Greek language, like many others, had its limitations. Some Greeks wrote the name as IAO, an attempt to capture the approximate sound of the Tetragrammaton. Others came close to forms like Iv, but none could fully capture the sound and mystery of the name. These attempts show us something fundamental. The name of God, though written down, was always more than just a word. It was a symbol of His presence, of His identity. Even when the exact sound was lost in the mists of time, the meaning and sanctity of the name never disappeared. What we've learned over all these centuries of history is that the name YHWH transcends any simple issue of pronunciation. It's a name filled with spiritual depth, mystery, and reverence. And even though many attempts have been made to vocalize it accurately, its true power lies not in the sound of the letters but in what it represents. The God who was, who is, and who always will be. So, even though today the name YHWH appears as Lord or God in our Bibles, it remains as a sacred echo through the ages, a reminder that God's power goes far beyond words. Now, one of the most intriguing questions is, what exactly does the name YHWH mean? We've already explored the mystery surrounding its pronunciation, but what about its meaning? Here, the scriptures offer a fascinating clue, one that takes us back to one of the most iconic moments in the Bible, Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush, as told in the book of Exodus. Picture the scene. Moses, a fugitive in the desert, suddenly encounters a supernatural vision, a bush engulfed in flames but not consumed. Then, from within the bush, the voice of God calls his name. God introduces himself to Moses, saying that he will free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Moses, bewildered, asks a crucial question. When I go to the Israelites and say, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name? What should I tell them?" And here comes the answer that has echoed through the ages. I am who I am, or, in another translation, I will be who I will be. God continues, "Tell the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." This response is more than just a name. It's a profound revelation of God's nature. The name YHWH seems to be connected to the Hebrew verb for to be or to exist. In other words, God does not define himself in a limited or fixed way. He is always present, always existing beyond time and space. This name, I am, suggests an eternal and unchanging nature, something that cannot be fully captured by human language. Later, God reinforces this message to Moses. YHWH, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. It's as if God is saying, I am the one who exists by myself, who depends on nothing and no one. I am the God who was with your ancestors and who will always be with you, eternally. But there's something even deeper in this I am. By using this name, God is not only declaring his existence but also his closeness. He is the God who is here and now with the people of Israel. And just as he was with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he continues to be the present and active God, capable of delivering and transforming. This play on words between I am and the name YHWH is filled with meaning. In the first person, God reveals himself as Ihyeh, I am. In the third person, the name becomes YHWH, something like he is or he will be. The name of God, therefore, encapsulates both his eternity and his promise of continuous presence. However, some scholars believe that this story in Exodus might be an attempt to recontextualize God's name, offering a more philosophical explanation for a name that was already ancient and perhaps even lost in its original meaning. The idea is that the author of Exodus was creating a popular etymology, reinterpreting the divine name based on this verb, to be, to communicate something profound about the divine nature. Either way, what is certain is that the name YHWH, revealed to Moses, carries a powerful message. The God of Israel is. He exists, eternally present, sovereign over time and creation, and yet close enough to hear his people's cries and respond to their needs. This revelation is at the heart of Israelite faith. YHWH is not a distant God, tied to a specific location or natural phenomenon. He is the living God, always active, whose name and existence transcend any human attempt to categorize him. He is not just the God who was. He is the God who will always be, walking alongside his people from generation to generation. And so, even though the pronunciation of YHWH has been lost, and his name replaced by Lord in many traditions, the deep meaning of I am remains alive. God is the one who is, and that truth echoes through all time, reminding us of his constant and unchanging presence. Now, we arrive at the conclusion of this incredible journey through the history of God's name. What we've seen so far is how the name YHWH transcends time and space, carrying with it a deep and eternal meaning. But the impact of this name is not limited to its theological significance or the attempts to recover its pronunciation. The name YHWH, despite all the changes over the centuries, became a symbol of power and mystery that shaped entire generations, especially the people of Israel. And this brings us to a fascinating aspect: the legacy of YHWH. Although the original pronunciation has been lost, and the use of the name was replaced by Lord or God in many traditions, the truth is that this name continued to resonate in powerful ways. After the name was revealed to Moses, YHWH became the center of Israel's identity. This name was directly tied to the covenant God made with them, the promise that he would always be present, guiding, protecting, and delivering. Whenever the people remembered the name YHWH, they remembered that he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who brought them out of Egypt, the God who had an eternal commitment to them. But the impact doesn't stop there. Throughout biblical history, especially during times of crisis and exile, the name YHWH served as an anchor of faith. Think of Babylon, when the Israelites were taken captive, their land destroyed, and their temple razed. Even in the midst of so much pain and uncertainty, the name YHWH remained. He was the living proof that, despite everything, God had not abandoned them. And no matter how much the circumstances changed, YHWH would always be the present and faithful God. This truth was reaffirmed on many occasions. The prophet Isaiah himself, in a moment of great despair for Israel, declared, "YHWH is my salvation. I will not fear, for he is my strength and my song." Even when the world around them seemed to be falling apart, the name YHWH offered an unbreakable hope. And over time, as Judaism expanded, and later Christianity, the name YHWH came to symbolize something even greater. He was no longer just the God of one nation. He was the God of all creation, the sovereign over all peoples. The name that had once been restricted to Israel was now becoming known to the world. But here's the crucial detail. Even with the expansion of this faith, the reverence for the name YHWH never disappeared. The substitution of Lord in many translations did not lessen the weight and power of the Tetragrammaton. On the contrary, it solidified it as something even more sacred. In many traditions, even the word Lord was read with deep reverence, a way of keeping alive the sanctity of the name that had been spoken for so long and later preserved in silence. And this legacy continues to this day. The name YHWH, though shrouded in mystery, remains a symbol of faith for billions of people around the world. It represents not only God's power and sovereignty, but also his closeness, his eternal promise to be present with his people. When we look at the history of the name YHWH, we see more than just a linguistic puzzle or a religious tradition. We see the testimony of a God who revealed himself in a personal and intimate way, and who allowed his name, so sacred, to be known, and then protected with such care that it eventually transcended mere words. And that's why, even today, when we speak of YHWH, we are talking about something much greater than just a word. We are speaking of a name that has carried the weight of history, survived centuries of reverence and mystery, and that, even without a definitive pronunciation, continues to resonate as the name of an eternal God, one who is present and deeply committed to his people, the one who is forever. Thus, the name of YHWH, hidden within the pages of history, still echoes in our hearts, reminding us of his eternal promise. He is the God who always will be.